10 years of marriage were dismantled on a rainy Tuesday evening over an $80 steak. Nathaniel thought he was brilliant, sliding a thick manila envelope across the linen tablecloth at our favorite anniversary spot. "Just some standard restructuring documents for the new shell company, sweetheart," he murmured, swirling his Cabernet, refusing to meet my eyes. He didn't know I had already read the deleted emails between him and his 24-year-old assistant, Chloe. He didn't know I recognized his divorce attorney's watermark bleeding through the heavy cardstock. I took his expensive gold pen, smiled at the man I once loved, and signed away my marriage. Then I disappeared, leaving him to wake up to a ghost and a crumbling empire. Our 10th anniversary fell on a day that felt heavy, the kind of late October evening where the air in Seattle hangs thick with impending rain. We were seated at L'Écume, a French restaurant perched on the edge of the waterfront, the exact place where Nathaniel had proposed to me a decade ago. Back then, we were just two hungry kids with a shared dream and a mountain of student debt. He was the charismatic face, the salesman who could charm water from a stone. I was the architect, the coder who spent sleepless nights building the foundational algorithms that would eventually become Sentinel Tech, the cybersecurity firm that made us multi-millionaires. Now, Nathaniel wore a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than our first car, and a Patek Philippe watch that I had bought him for his 35th birthday. He looked the part of the successful tech CEO. But to me, sitting across from him, the illusion was shattering in real time. "The scallops are excellent tonight, Caroline," he said, cutting into his food with a forced mechanical rhythm. He had barely looked at me since we sat down. His eyes kept darting to his phone, which sat face down on the table, a classic tell. "They are," I replied, my voice smooth, betraying nothing of the storm raging in my chest. "You seem distracted, Nate. Is everything okay at the office?" "Just the usual," he sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "The board is pushing for the corporate restructuring before Q4 ends. It's a lot of red tape, which actually reminds me." He reached down to the fine leather briefcase resting by his feet. My heart didn't flutter. It turned to ice. I knew what was coming. I had known for exactly 7 days, 14 hours, and 20 minutes. A week ago, Nathaniel had carelessly left his iPad synced to his private cloud on my home office desk. I had opened it to check the weather, only to be met with an iMessage notification that read, "Did you get her to sign the exit package yet? I'm tired of waiting, baby." The sender was Chloe, our energetic, fiercely ambitious director of communications, whom I had personally mentored. I had spent that entire afternoon diving into the digital breadcrumbs Nathaniel thought he was clever enough to hide. He wasn't. I found the hotel receipts, the jewelry purchases, the encrypted emails with a ruthless divorce attorney named Bennett Hayes. Nathaniel was planning to blindside me. Washington is a community property state, but Sentinel Tech was a complex beast. Through a web of offshore holding companies and newly drafted corporate bylaws, Nathaniel and his lawyers had spent the last 6 months quietly shifting the company's assets, creating a structure where my 50% equity would be heavily diluted, effectively forcing me into a corner where I'd have to accept a lowball buyout or face years of ruinous litigation. The crown jewel of his plan was a spousal consent form hidden inside a massive stack of corporate restructuring paperwork. If I signed it, I legally waived my rights to contest the new corporate structure, and buried on page 47 was a quiet, insidious dissolution of shared assets clause. It was, for all intents and purposes, a pre-packaged divorce and a financial execution. He placed the thick manila envelope on the table, right between the flickering candlelight and my half-empty glass of Pinot Noir. "I know it's terrible timing," Nathaniel said, attempting an apologetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But Bennett needs these back by tomorrow morning to file with the SEC. It's just the standard restructuring consents we talked about last month, shifting the subsidiaries under the new umbrella." I looked at the envelope. It looked so innocuous, just paper, but it represented the death of my youth, the betrayal of my trust, and the assassination of the life we built together. "On our anniversary, Nate?" I asked, tilting my head, playing the part of the slightly annoyed but compliant wife perfectly. I know, I'm a terrible husband," he chuckled nervously. The irony of his words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "I promise, I'll make it up to you this weekend. We'll take the boat out to the San Juans. Just us." Just us, I thought. And the ghost of Chloe, and the ghost of the marriage you just killed. "All right," I said softly. "Give me a pen." He blinked, clearly surprised by how easy it was. He had brought his favorite Mont Blanc pen, practically unscrewing the cap before handing it to me. "You don't want to read it over?" he asked, a fleeting shadow of guilt or perhaps paranoia crossing his face. "It's just corporate housekeeping, right?" I held his gaze. I wanted to remember this exact moment. I wanted to remember the greed and the cowardice in his eyes. "I trust you, Nathaniel." I pulled the documents from the envelope, 50 pages of dense, size 10 legal jargon. I flipped to the back. There were 3 signature lines, one for the corporate restructuring, one for the asset reassignment, and one for the notary, which his lawyer had already fraudulently stamped and predated. I took the pen and signed my name, not with a trembling hand, but with sharp, decisive strokes. Caroline Miller. What Nathaniel failed to realize in his arrogance was that I was the architect of Sentinel Tech. While he was busy wooing investors and sleeping with his communications director, I was the one managing the patent portfolio. 3 years ago, to protect our intellectual property from a frivolous lawsuit, we transferred the core algorithmic patents, the absolute lifeblood of Sentinel Tech's software, to an anonymous shell company called Apex Solutions LLC. What Nathaniel had forgotten, or perhaps never bothered to fully understand, was that Apex Solutions was wholly owned by me, registered under my maiden name before we ever got married. Sentinel Tech was merely licensing the tech from Apex for $1 a year. By having me sign these specific papers, effectively severing our joint assets and waiving my rights to Sentinel Tech, he was successfully cutting me out of his company. But he was also unknowingly severing Sentinel Tech's license to use the Apex patents. Without my joint marital goodwill, Sentinel Tech had no legal right to its own software. He was handing me the guillotine, completely unaware that his own neck was already in the block. "Thank you, Care." He breathed a sigh of relief, quickly snatching the papers back and sliding them into his briefcase as if they might catch fire. "You're the best." "Happy anniversary, Nathaniel," I said, raising my glass. I took a sip, the wine tasting like victory and ashes. The drive back to our Mercer Island estate was suffocatingly quiet. The rain had finally started to fall, drumming a steady, melancholic rhythm against the roof of the Mercedes. Nathaniel had turned the radio to a soft jazz station, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. He was practically buzzing with adrenaline. He thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the quiet, agreeable woman sitting in the passenger seat. I watched the city lights blur through the wet glass, my mind calculating the hours I had left. The flight was booked for 4 a.m., a private charter out of Boeing Field. It was extravagant, but commercial travel left too thick of a paper trail, and I needed to vanish completely. I needed to be a ghost by the time the sun came up. When we pulled into the driveway, the sprawling, modern glass and steel house felt alien to me. It was a monument to our success, filled with imported Italian furniture and modern art that Nathaniel bought because someone told him it was a good investment. It had never really felt like a home. "I'm going to pour a nightcap," Nathaniel said, loosening his tie as we stepped into the grand foyer. "Want one?" "No, thank you," I replied smoothly. "I have a bit of a headache. I think I'm just going to take a long bath and head to bed." "Suit yourself," he said, already walking toward his prized mahogany wet bar. "Love you." The casual ease with which he threw those 2 words over his shoulder made my stomach turn. Love you. A reflex, a habit, a lie. I walked up the floating glass staircase, my heels clicking softly against the treads. I didn't go to the master bathroom. I went straight to my home office. I locked the door behind me and turned on the small desk lamp, bathing the room in a warm, low glow. The clock read 10:15 p.m. I had exactly 5 hours. I opened my laptop. The screen illuminated my face as I bypassed my regular operating system and booted from a hidden, encrypted partition. Over the last 7 days, while Nathaniel thought I was planning our anniversary party, I had been executing a flawless digital disappearing act. First, I routed the entirety of my personal savings, which thankfully, I had always kept separate from our joint accounts through a series of offshore trusts. I transferred the ownership of Apex Solutions LLC to a blind trust based in Zurich. I wasn't just leaving Nathaniel, I was systematically dismantling my legal existence in the United States. When I was done, Caroline Miller would be a financial ghost. I opened the server dashboard for Sentinel Tech. Because I built the system, I held the master administrative credentials. Credentials Nathaniel didn't even know existed. With a few keystrokes, I initiated a script I had written 3 days ago. It was a beautiful piece of code. Silent and devastating. It wouldn't destroy any data that would be a crime. Instead, it systematically revoked the license keys for the core algorithm across all of Sentinel Tech's active client servers, scheduled to trigger exactly 72 hours from now. On Friday morning, every major bank, hospital, and government contractor using Sentinel's cybersecurity software would receive a fatal error. License expired. Core IP access revoked. Nathaniel's company would turn into an empty, useless shell in the blink of an eye. And when his engineers frantically tried to fix it, they would find a legally binding block, redirecting them to the new IP owner in Switzerland, demanding a licensing fee of $50 million a month. A quiet knock on my office door made me freeze. "Care?" Nathaniel's voice was muffled through the heavy oak. "You still awake?" I snapped the laptop shut. "Just finishing up an email to my sister, Nate. Be out in a minute." "All right, I'm crashing. The wine is hitting me. Don't stay up too late." "I won't." I waited, holding my breath, until I heard the heavy door of the master bedroom click shut down the hall. I exhaled, the sound trembling slightly in the quiet room. The adrenaline was finally catching up to me. I moved to my personal safe, hidden behind a bookshelf. I spun the dial my mother's birthday and pulled out the items I had prepared. A new passport under my mother's maiden name, a prepaid encrypted cell phone, and a stack of $50 bills banded together. I also pulled out one final document. It was a letter, handwritten on heavy cardstock. I had drafted it a dozen times, but the final version was short, devoid of emotion, and surgically precise. "Nathaniel, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Do not look for me. Any attempt to contact me or track me down will result in the immediate public release of the contents of the USB drive on this desk." I read the emails, Nathaniel. I saw the receipts. I know about Chloe. I know about the restructuring. You wanted a divorce. You wanted my shares. You wanted a clean break without the messy financial consequences. Congratulations, you have it. The papers you had me sign tonight gave you the house, the cars, and the company. I concede, but you forgot who built your empire. Check the IP licenses for the Sentinel framework. You'll find they belong to Apex Solutions. And as of tonight, Apex Solutions has revoked your user privileges. You thought you were playing chess, Nate, but you were just playing with the pieces I gave you. Goodbye, Caroline. I placed the letter in the center of the dark oak desk. I took the USB drive loaded with every sordid text, hotel receipt, and piece of evidence of his infidelity, meticulously organized into folders, and set it like a paperweight on top of the note. The physical act of placing it down felt like shedding a lead coat. I was no longer the betrayed wife. I was a sovereign entity, reborn in the fire of his deceit. By 1 a.m., the house was a tomb. The only sound was the relentless Seattle rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I moved through the shadows with the silent efficiency of a burglar in my own home. Packing took less than 20 minutes because I wasn't taking much. I had purchased 2 sleek, matte black Rimowa suitcases earlier in the week. Into them went a carefully curated wardrobe of practical, high-quality clothing, entirely devoid of the flashy designer labels Nathaniel had insisted I wear to his corporate galas. I packed my jewelry box, taking only the pieces that held real sentimental value or high resale liquidity. Then came the symbolic purge. I walked into my massive walk-in closet. It was lined with thousands of dollars of haute couture, rows of Louboutins, and Hermès bags. The uniform of the successful CEO's wife. I left all of it. Let Chloe move in and drown in my hand-me-downs. Let her play dress-up in the life she had fought so dirty to steal. I walked back into the master bedroom. Nathaniel was sprawled across the king-sized bed, softly snoring, a silk sleep mask pulled over his eyes. He looked peaceful, innocent almost. It disgusted me. I approached his bedside table. He had emptied his pockets there, his wallet, his keys, and the manila envelope he had been so anxious to secure. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled my left hand up. The 4-carat emerald-cut diamond ring caught the dim ambient light from the hallway, flashing brilliantly. It was a beautiful stone, completely devoid of flaws, just like the fake life we had curated for the public. I slid it off my finger. The skin underneath felt strangely light, cool against the air. I placed the ring squarely on top of the manila envelope. The platinum band clinked faintly against the polished wood of the nightstand. Nathaniel snorted in his sleep, shifting slightly, but he didn't wake. I took one last look at the room, at the man who had promised to protect me, who had instead tried to bury me. There were no tears. I had cried all the tears I had in me during that first afternoon on the office floor when I read his messages. Now, there was only cold, crystalline resolve. I picked up my suitcases and walked out the door, not looking back. My Uber Black was idling at the bottom of the long driveway, its headlights cutting through the heavy downpour. I loaded my bags into the trunk, sliding into the leather back seat. "Boeing Field, private terminal," I told the driver. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, pulling smoothly away from the curb. As we drove over the I-90 floating bridge, leaving Mercer Island behind, I rolled the window down just an inch. The freezing, rain-slicked wind whipped against my face. I pulled my old iPhone from my coat pocket, the one with the Sentinel Tech family plan, the one filled with 10 years of photos, contacts, and memories. I cracked the window a little further, and as we hit the center of the bridge, over the deep, black waters of Lake Washington, I dropped the phone into the abyss. It was a physical severing. Caroline Miller, the devoted wife, the silent partner, sank to the bottom of the lake. By 3:30 a.m., I was sitting in the plush leather seat of a Gulfstream G 550, a glass of vintage champagne in my hand. The flight attendant, a discreet woman named Sarah, smiled at me as she secured the cabin. "We are cleared for takeoff, Miss Hayes," she said, using my mother's maiden name. My new name. "It will be a smooth flight to Geneva." "Thank you, Sarah," I replied softly. As the jet engines roared to life, pressing me back into my seat, I closed my eyes. We tore through the storm clouds, breaking through the atmosphere until the turbulence smoothed out into absolute stillness. I opened my eyes and looked out the window. We had climbed above the weather. The moon was brilliant and full, illuminating a sea of white clouds below. Somewhere down there, miles below in the rain and the dark, Nathaniel was sleeping peacefully. He would wake up in a few hours. He would reach across the bed and find it empty. He would see the ring on the envelope. He would walk into my office and read the letter. He would scramble to his computer, desperately trying to log into the servers, watching in real time as the empire he thought he had stolen slipped like water through his greedy fingers. His world was about to end. But up here, above the clouds, bathed in moonlight, my world was just beginning. Geneva welcomed me with a crisp, biting wind that felt like a baptism. Stepping off the plane onto the tarmac at Cointrin Airport, the heavy, rain-soaked oppression of Seattle was a lifetime away. I was no longer the betrayed wife of a tech billionaire. I was Caroline Hayes, a woman with a clean slate, a hidden fortune, and an empire of my own design waiting to be awakened. My new residence was a minimalist penthouse in the Eaux Vives district, overlooking the impossibly blue waters of Lake Geneva. I had secured it months ago through a corporate proxy, paying a year's rent in advance. The apartment was stripped of anything soft or sentimental, all sleek marble, chrome, and floor-to-ceiling glass. It mirrored the ice that had replaced my heart. After unpacking my 2 suitcases, I made myself a cup of black coffee, sat at the massive oak dining table, and opened my laptop. It was 4 p.m. in Switzerland, which meant it was 7 a.m. back in Seattle. Nathaniel's alarm would be going off right about now. I hadn't just left him a letter, I had left myself a window. During my meticulous preparations, I had installed a discreet, encrypted backdoor into the Mercer Island Estate's internal security system. It was technically a violation of the very privacy protocols Sentinel Tech prided itself on, but I was past caring about the moral high ground. I wanted to see the exact moment the illusion broke. I wanted to witness the architect of my misery realize he was trapped in a burning building. I pulled up the feed for the master bedroom. On the screen, bathed in the gray light of a Pacific Northwest morning, Nathaniel stirred. He groaned, swatting at the alarm clock on his nightstand. He rolled over, his arm instinctively reaching out for me. His hand found nothing but cold, empty Egyptian cotton. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, his perfectly manicured hair a messy halo. "Care?" he mumbled, his voice scratchy through the audio feed. He swung his legs out of bed. That was when he saw it. The manila envelope was sitting exactly where he had left it, but the 4-carat emerald-cut diamond ring resting on top of it caught the morning light like a beacon. Nathaniel froze. The casual, arrogant ease melted from his posture, replaced by a rigid, sudden tension. He picked up the ring, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were radioactive. Then, he noticed the envelope had been moved. He rushed out of the bedroom, the camera feed switching seamlessly to the hallway, then to my home office. He burst through the door. I watched as he saw the desk, the pristine, empty surface, save for the heavy cardstock letter and the silver USB drive acting as a paperweight. He dropped the ring into his pocket and snatched the letter. It took him less than 30 seconds to read it. I knew the words by heart, and I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the page. I watched the color drain completely from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure. His mouth opened and closed silently. I read the emails, Nathaniel. I saw the receipts. I know about Chloe. He dropped the letter and lunged for his laptop, his hands shaking so violently he fumbled the USB drive twice before managing to slot it into the port. He opened the drive. Even through the security camera, I could see the reflection of the screen playing across his pale face. Folders named Chloe, texts, Aspen, hotel, receipts, offshore, drafts, and divorce, strategy. I had curated a digital museum of his betrayal. No, 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 he chanted, a pathetic, breathless mantra. He grabbed his phone and dialed frantically. I didn't need to guess who he was calling. A moment later, my burner phone sitting next to my coffee cup in Geneva lit up with a Seattle area code. I watched the screen glow, took a slow sip of my coffee, and let it go to voicemail. He tried again. And again. And again. On the video feed, Nathaniel hurled his phone across the room. It shattered against the custom oak bookshelves. He gripped the edges of my desk, his knuckles turning white, his chest heaving. He had planned to discard me like an outdated piece of software, forcing me into a corner with his fraudulent restructuring papers. He thought he was playing a masterstroke of corporate chess. Instead, He had just signed away his entire life. He scrambled to the landline, dialing a number from memory. "Harrison," he barked into the receiver, his voice cracking with panic. Harrison Bradley was his attack dog, the senior partner at the law firm handling the Sentinel Tech restructuring. "Stop the filings. Harrison, listen to me. Do not file the spousal consent forms. Pull them. Pull everything." A pause. I leaned in, savoring the silence. "What do you mean they were filed electronically at midnight?" Nathaniel screamed, the sound distorting the camera's microphone. "I didn't authorize that. We have to retract them. Caroline is gone." "She knew. She transferred the IP." He listened for another agonizing minute, his face contorting from fear into sheer, unadulterated terror. The restructuring documents were ironclad. By forcing me to sign them, he had legally separated our assets, taking full ownership of Sentinel Tech and its liabilities, while formally acknowledging my full, unencumbered ownership of any assets in my name, including Apex Solutions. He had built his own gallows, tied the noose, and begged me to pull the lever. He slammed the phone down and buried his face in his hands. I closed the laptop. The silence of my Geneva apartment felt like a standing ovation. Thursday was a day of silent, frantic bleeding for Nathaniel. Through my network monitors, I watched his IT team desperately trying to trace the master administrative logs, hunting for the ghost in their system. But I was the one who wrote the Sentinel Tech security architecture. I knew every blind spot, every backdoor, and every patch. They were looking for a breach from the outside, entirely unaware that the kill switch had been hard-coded into the very foundation of the software 3 years ago. Then came Friday. 72 hours had passed since I initiated the script. It was 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, the exact moment the East Coast financial markets were in full swing and the West Coast tech hubs were firing up their servers. I sat in my home office in Geneva, the sun setting over the Alps, painting the sky in strokes of violent purple and gold. I had a multi-monitor setup running, displaying the real-time server status of Sentinel Tech's top 50 clients. At exactly 9:01 a.m., the lights on my dashboard began to turn red. It didn't happen slowly. It was a digital guillotine. First went the regional banks, then the healthcare networks, finally, the massive government contractors. Across the United States, thousands of network administrators stared at their screens in horror as their Sentinel Tech cybersecurity shields simply evaporated. The error message was identical across the board, written in stark, uncompromising text. Fatal error. Core IP license expired. Access revoked by owner Apex Solutions, LLC. Sentinel Tech no longer holds valid distribution rights. System locked to prevent unauthorized intellectual property theft. It was a masterclass in corporate sabotage. I hadn't hacked them. I hadn't stolen their data. I had simply exercised my legal right as the patent holder to terminate an expired license. But the effect was catastrophic. Without the Sentinel Shield, these multi-billion-dollar companies were completely exposed to the open web. Through the internal Slack channels I was still quietly monitoring, the panic was a beautiful, chaotic symphony. At here, the entire grid is down. What is Apex Solutions? David, Chen lead engineer. I'm locked out of the core framework. The encryption keys have been rotated. Who authorized this? Chloe, comms. Guys, the phones are melting. Chase Bank is threatening to sue us for breach of contract. Where is Nathaniel? Where was Nathaniel? He was standing in the middle of the Sentinel Tech boardroom, staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. I knew this because I had one final card to play. At 9:15 a.m., while the company was in absolute freefall, I drafted an anonymous email. I attached the contents of the USB drive, the explicit texts, the hotel receipts, the evidence of his affair with Chloe, and, most importantly, the digital trail showing Nathaniel had deliberately attempted to defraud his co-founder and wife out of her equity to fund his new life. I didn't send it to the tabloids. I sent it directly to the Sentinel Tech Board of Directors, the primary venture capital investors, and the legal compliance team. The fallout was instantaneous. By 10 a.m., an emergency board meeting was convened. I couldn't see the video, but I could read the transcripts hitting the secure server logs later that afternoon. "You forced her out?" Arthur Vance, the ruthless chairman of the board, had demanded, his voice reportedly echoing through the glass walls of the conference room. "You executed a fraudulent asset division to hide your affair with the communications director, and in doing so, you handed over the licensing rights to our entire product line?" "I didn't know," Nathaniel had pleaded, the swagger completely gone. "I thought the IP was bundled in the joint assets. Harrison said the restructuring would cover everything." "Harrison is a divorce attorney, not a patent lawyer." "You idiot," Arthur had roared. "Chase Bank just pulled their contract. The DoD is threatening a federal investigation for exposing their networks, and we have a ransom note from a Swiss shell company demanding $50 million a month to turn the lights back on." "You didn't just ruin your marriage, Nathaniel. You bankrupted this company." At 11:30 a.m., Chloe was escorted out of the building by corporate security, crying hysterically, her career in Seattle effectively incinerated. At 12 p.m., Nathaniel was formally suspended as CEO, his company phone and laptop confiscated. He was escorted out the back entrance to avoid the growing swarm of tech journalists gathering in the lobby. He had wanted a clean break. He had wanted the company, the money, and the young assistant. In less than 4 days, he had lost his wife, his fortune, his reputation, and his empire. I closed the server logs, leaned back in my ergonomic chair, and poured myself a glass of incredibly expensive, incredibly dry Swiss white wine. The taste of absolute victory was intoxicating. The weeks that followed were a study in the brutal efficiency of consequence. I had transitioned seamlessly into my new identity. Caroline Hayes was a quiet, wealthy consultant who spent her mornings jogging along the lake and her afternoons managing an aggressive, highly lucrative tech portfolio through a proxy firm. My wealth manager, Dieter Kaufmann, was a stoic man in his late 50s who asked no questions and executed my commands with lethal Swiss precision. The American lawyers are becoming persistent, Miss Hayes, Dieter noted during our weekly meeting in his mahogany-paneled office on the Rue du Rhône. He slid a thick stack of cease and desist letters across the desk. They were plastered with the letterhead of 3 different elite Seattle law firms. "Persistent but powerless, I assume?" I asked, not bothering to touch the papers. "Entirely," Dieter smiled, a rare, thin stretching of his lips. Apex Solutions LLC is protected under the strictest layers of our corporate privacy laws. They have attempted to file injunctions, but without a named executive to serve, and with the IP legally registered here, their federal courts have no jurisdiction. Furthermore, your former associate is currently facing a mountain of domestic litigation. Tell me about the bleeding, Dieter. Dieter opened a leather-bound folio. It is extensive. Sentinel Tech is facing class action lawsuits from 14 major clients for breach of contract and gross negligence. Because Mr. Miller signed those restructuring documents, he absorbed 100% of the company's liability. The board has formally severed him, voided his golden parachute under a morals clause, thanks to the convenient leak of his indiscretions, and they are suing him personally for fiduciary malpractice. I let the words wash over me. Fiduciary malpractice. It meant they were coming for his personal assets to pay the company's debts. "And his personal finances?" I pressed. "Frozen," Dieter replied. "The Mercer Island estate has been collateralized by the bank. His offshore accounts were seized pending the SEC investigation into the fraudulent restructuring filings. He is, for all intents and purposes, entirely insolvent." Nathaniel was a cornered animal, and like all cornered animals, he became desperate. He realized that his only way out was to find me. If he could find me, he thought he could bully, manipulate, or beg me into transferring the Apex patents back to Sentinel Tech. He didn't understand that I wasn't hiding because I was afraid. I was hiding because I didn't want to be bothered by the stench of his desperation. Through my residual network taps, I learned he had pawned his beloved Patek Philippe watch and his vintage Porsche to hire a high-end private investigator named Simon Cross. Cross was a former MI6 operative who specialized in finding high-net-worth individuals who didn't want to be found. He was good, but I was the architect. I knew Cross would start with my financial footprint, so I left him one. A carefully constructed breadcrumb trail that looked like a sloppy mistake. I routed a small, recurring payment from one of my secondary burner accounts to a luxury long-term rental agency in Monaco. I even had Dieter arrange for a local proxy to pick up mail under the name Caroline Miller at a specific high-end villa overlooking the Mediterranean. It took Cross exactly 3 weeks to find the bait. I watched the drama unfold via a hired local security contact I had placed in Monaco. Nathaniel, running on the last fumes of his borrowed cash, flew commercial, a humiliating experience for a man used to private jets to Nice, and took a train into Monaco. He showed up at the villa's wrought iron gates, looking haggard, unshaven, and unhinged. He buzzed the intercom incessantly. When the gate finally opened, he practically sprinted up the driveway, expecting to find me lounging by the infinity pool, ready to be berated into submission. Instead, he was greeted by my security proxy, a massive former French Foreign Legionnaire named Luc. "Where is she?" Nathaniel screamed, trying to push past the giant of a man. "Caroline, get out here! You're ruining my life!" Luc calmly placed a hand on Nathaniel's chest, stopping him dead. "Monsieur, there is no Caroline here. This property is leased to a corporate entity." "I know she's here. Her name is on the mail." Luc reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. "I was instructed to give this to a frantic American matching your description should one ever arrive." Nathaniel snatched the envelope. Inside was a single, printed piece of paper. Not a heartfelt letter, not an explanation, just a printed screenshot. It was a screenshot of the Mercer Island Estates public foreclosure listing, stamped with the word "sold." Underneath it, I had typed a single sentence. "Enjoy the Riviera, Nate. Hope the flight wasn't too cramped." My contact reported that Nathaniel fell to his knees on the cobblestone driveway, clutching the paper, finally broken. The illusion of his control was entirely shattered. He was a man with no company, no money, no wife, and no home, stranded in one of the most expensive cities in the world with a return ticket he could barely afford. Back in Geneva, I closed the encrypted email from Luc and deleted the thread. The storm had passed. The wreckage of Nathaniel Miller was a smoldering ruin thousands of miles away, a monument to his own arrogance and greed. I walked out onto the terrace of my penthouse. The air was freezing, the sky a brilliant, blinding blue. Below me, the city hummed with life, indifferent to the drama of my past. I had been the quiet partner, the silent builder, the loyal wife who stayed in the shadows while he took the spotlight. He thought that made me weak. He thought that meant I was disposable. He forgot that the person who builds the house is the only one who knows exactly where to place the dynamite to bring it all down. I breathed in the cold Swiss air, feeling the absolute unbridled freedom of a ghost who had rewritten her own haunting. The game was over. The board was cleared. And for the first time in 10 years, I was exactly where I belonged, at the top of an empire, answering to no one but myself. Winter descended on Geneva with a pristine, unforgiving cold. The snow capped the Jura Mountains, turning the landscape into a stark painting of white and gray. It suited my mood perfectly. I had spent the last 2 months watching Sentinel Tech bleed out from a safe distance, but destroying Nathaniel's empire was only the first phase of the architecture. A true visionary doesn't just burn a building down. She buys the scorched earth for pennies and builds a skyscraper on the ashes. Sentinel Tech was officially in Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Without the Apex Solutions IP license, their software was useless code, their hardware just expensive metal. The 14 class action lawsuits had drained their operating capital, and the board of directors was desperately trying to liquidate anything of value to appease their furious creditors. But I wasn't the only vulture circling the carcass. Horizon Capital, the Silicon Valley venture firm that had backed Sentinel from our Series A funding, was out for blood. The lead partner on our account was a man named Richard Sterling. Richard was a quintessential Sand Hill Road predator, Harvard-educated, ruthlessly charming, and possessing a moral compass that strictly pointed toward profit. He had always patronized me during board meetings, treating me as Nathaniel's quirky coding wife, rather than the genius keeping the company afloat. I knew Richard wouldn't just take a $90 million write-off lying down. On a frigid Tuesday morning, my private line, the one heavily encrypted and strictly monitored by Dieter Kaufman's security team, rang. I was sitting in my Oviv's penthouse, watching the snow fall over the lake while reviewing the draft for a new corporate entity I was forming in Luxembourg. "Miss Hayes," Dieter's voice was clipped, a rare sign of tension. "We have a situation. A man named Richard Sterling is sitting in the lobby of my office building on the Rue du Rhône. He is refusing to leave until he speaks with the managing director of Apex Solutions." I paused, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. Richard had figured it out. It was inevitable, really. Nathaniel was too stupid to connect the dots, but Richard had an army of forensic accountants. He would have traced the legal phrasing of the IP transfer, noticed the deliberate timing of the spousal consent forms, and recognized the absolute, surgical precision of the strike. He knew Nathaniel wasn't smart enough to orchestrate his own demise so flawlessly. "Did he bring lawyers, Dieter?" I asked calmly. "2. American. Aggressive suits, bad French," Dieter replied. "Shall I have building security escort them to the street?" "No," I smiled, a cold thrill running through me. "Bring them up to the secondary conference room. Strip them of their phones and laptops at the door. Standard security protocol. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I dressed carefully. A tailored charcoal suit from Acris, a silk blouse, and a vintage Cartier watch. I wasn't the invisible wife in a tech hoodie anymore. I was the executioner. When I walked into the conference room at Dieter's firm, the air was thick with masculine impatience. Richard Sterling was pacing the length of the glass-walled room, his custom Tom Ford suit looking slightly wrinkled from the transatlantic flight. His 2 lawyers sat at the long mahogany table, looking profoundly uncomfortable under the watchful eye of Dieter's security detail. Richard stopped pacing the moment I walked in. He stared at me, his eyes widening in a mixture of shock, fury, and begrudging respect. "Caroline," he breathed, running a hand over his face, "I'll be damned. I told the forensic team it had to be an inside job, but I didn't think you had the teeth for it." "Hello, Richard," I said smoothly, taking the seat at the head of the table. "I didn't offer my hand. I prefer Miss Hayes now. To what do I owe the pleasure of this unannounced intrusion?" Richard scoffed, leaning heavily against the table. "Drop the act, Caroline. You hijacked $90 million of Horizon Capital's money. You used Nathaniel's infidelity to execute a hostile takeover of Sentinel's IP, tanked the company, and now you're holding the entire tech sector hostage. It's a cute trick, but the adults are talking now." He motioned to his lawyers. One of them, a sweaty man named Bradley, slid a thick manila folder across the table toward me. "We are prepared to offer Apex Solutions a one-time buyout of $20 million for the perpetual rights to the Sentinel framework," Richard said, his tone dripping with fake magnanimity. "You take the money, you stay in your little Swiss hideaway, and we walk away. If you refuse, I will personally go to the SEC, the DOJ, and the federal bankruptcy courts in Seattle. I will expose your little shell game. I will have you indicted for corporate sabotage and wire fraud. You won't see a dime, and you'll spend the next 10 years in federal prison." I let silence fill the room. I looked at the folder, then up at Richard. He was trying to project dominance, but I could see the slight tremor in his hands. He was desperate. If Horizon lost this money, his career as a managing partner was over. "Are you finished, Richard?" I asked softly. "I need an answer, Caroline. Today. Let me explain reality to you." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "You aren't dealing with Nathaniel anymore. You are dealing with the architect. You think you have leverage? Let's review." I pulled a sleek tablet from my briefcase, provided by Dieter, entirely disconnected from any external network, and slid it across the table to him. "What is this?" Richard snapped. "That is a heavily encrypted, time-stamped dossier," I explained, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "While you were busy letting Nathaniel parade around Silicon Valley, your compliance team failed to do their due diligence. 3 years ago, when the patents were transferred to Apex, Horizon Capital signed off on the audit. You officially recognized the transfer to avoid a liability lawsuit. You legally sanctioned my ownership." Richard's face paled. He remembered. "Secondly," I continued, "the restructuring documents Nathaniel forced me to sign, the ones that separated our assets, were drafted by your referred legal team, Harrison Bradley's firm. They explicitly stated that all assets solely in my name remained mine, free and clear of Sentinel's liabilities." "I didn't commit fraud, Richard. I simply signed the contract you and my husband put in front of me." "You knew what you were doing," Richard yelled, slamming his hand on the table. "I knew my husband was sleeping with his assistant and trying to leave me penniless." I shot back, the ice in my voice cracking like a whip. "I simply protected my assets. It is not my fault that your CEO was too busy committing adultery to read his own patent licensing agreements. If you go to the SEC, they will laugh you out of the room right before they fine Horizon Capital for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty to your own limited partners." I stood up, towering over his seated lawyers. "I am not selling you the IP for $20 million, Richard. In fact, I'm not selling it to you at all. I am going to wait for Sentinel Tech to be completely liquidated in bankruptcy court next month. And then, a new European holding company, one you will never be able to trace to me, is going to buy the physical assets, the client lists, and the hardware for pennies on the dollar. I am going to absorb the corpse of your investment." Richard stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The arrogant predator had just realized he was locked in the cage with the monster. "Get out of my city, Richard," I said, turning my back on him. "And if you ever show up uninvited again, I will release the dossier to the Wall Street Journal." The encounter with Richard Sterling was exhilarating, but it also served as a warning. The blast radius of Nathaniel's destruction was wider than I had anticipated, and the shrapnel was flying in all directions. I needed to tighten my defenses before the final bankruptcy auction in Seattle. A week later, a ghost from my past reached out, handing me the final weapon I needed on a silver platter. I received an email on an old, obscure account I had used years ago for a gaming forum. The subject line was simply Seattle. The body of the email contained a single sentence: "I know what Nathaniel and Richard did before the crash. I need help. C. Chloe." The 24-year-old director of communications, the woman who had sent those sickeningly sweet texts to my husband asking if he had gotten her to sign the exit package yet. After the crash, she had been fired, disgraced, and publicly humiliated when the board leaked the reason for Nathaniel's termination. I debated ignoring it, let her rot in the bed she made, but my curiosity and my strategic mind won out. I replied with a link to a secure, encrypted video conferencing room, setting the meeting for midnight Swiss time. When her face appeared on my screen, I almost didn't recognize her. The glossy, overconfident girl who used to strut through the Sentinel Tech offices in designer heels was gone. Her blonde hair was pulled into a messy knot, her skin pale and drawn, and she was sitting in what looked like a cheap, dimly lit motel room. "Caroline," she choked out, her voice trembling. "Thank God. I didn't know if you'd answer." "I have exactly 5 minutes, Chloe," I said, my face a mask of absolute indifference. "Why are you contacting me?" She swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm ruined. I can't get a job anywhere in the tech sector. The media tore me apart. Nathaniel, he abandoned me the second the money dried up. He blamed me for the leak. He hit me, Caroline. Before he left for Europe to try and find you, he hit me." A flicker of disgust passed through me, but I kept my voice level. "I am not your therapist, Chloe. You chose to sleep with a married man. You actively participated in a plot to defraud me. Why should I care about your current misfortune?" "Because I have proof of federal crimes," she blurted out, leaning into the camera. "And I know Richard Sterling just tried to corner you." That caught my attention. "Go on." When Nathaniel realized the company was going under, right before the servers locked down on that Friday, he panicked, Chloe explained, her words spilling out in a rush. "He called Richard. I was in the office with him. I recorded it on my phone. Caroline, they conspired to hide assets. Richard told Nathaniel to illegally transfer $5 million from the employee pension fund into a blind offshore account to cover their legal fees before the bankruptcy froze everything. It's a felony. Wire fraud, embezzlement, all of it." I leaned back in my chair, the gears in my mind turning rapidly. If Richard and Nathaniel had touched the employee pension funds, they had crossed a line that the federal government did not forgive. It was the kind of crime that carried mandatory minimum sentences in federal prison. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked. "Because the DOJ has subpoenaed me," Chloe sobbed. "They are investigating the collapse. They think I helped him hide the money because I was his assistant. I'm looking at accessory charges. I need a lawyer, Caroline, a good one, and I have absolutely nothing." She was pathetic. A minor predator who got caught in the jaws of a leviathan, but she was holding the key to my absolute, unassailable victory. "Send me the audio file," I commanded. "Will you help me?" she pleaded. "Send the file, Chloe. If it is authentic, I will wire $200,000 to a retainer account for Eleanor Crawford. She is the best white-collar criminal defense attorney in Seattle. She will arrange an immunity deal for you in exchange for handing the recording over to the feds." Chloe's relief was palpable. "Thank you. God, Caroline, I'm so sorry. For everything." "Don't apologize," I said coldly. "Just learn the lesson. Never build your life on a foundation of someone else's stolen bricks." I terminated the connection. 5 minutes later, an encrypted audio file landed in my inbox. I hit play. Through the static, Nathaniel's panicked voice echoed in my quiet Swiss apartment. "Richard, the IP is gone. She transferred it. We are dead in the water." Then, Richard's arrogant, commanding tone. "Shut up and listen to me, Nate. The board doesn't know yet. Before the SEC locks this down, you need to execute a backdoor transfer from the Level 4 Employee Pension Reserve. Route it through the Cayman shell we used for the Series B tax write-off. We need a war chest, or we are both going to jail." It was a smoking gun. A beautiful, indisputable smoking gun. I didn't just have the power to defeat them in the boardroom anymore. I had the power to strip them of their freedom. I forwarded the audio file to Dieter with a single instruction: prepare the final strike. The final act of the tragedy played out exactly 3 months after the night I signed those divorce papers. The United States Bankruptcy Court for the Western District of Washington was a drab, imposing building in downtown Seattle, smelling of stale floor wax and institutional despair. I wasn't there in person, of course. I was sitting comfortably in my Geneva office, watching a secure, closed-circuit feed of the proceedings arranged by my proxy legal team. The auction of Sentinel Tech's physical assets and remaining client contracts was a depressing affair. The company that was once valued at $1.2 billion was being carved up like a dead whale. Nathaniel was sitting in the back row of the gallery. He looked 10 years older. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit. His bespoke Italian wardrobe had been seized by creditors months ago. His hair was thinning, his posture slumped. He was there because he had to be. The bankruptcy trustee had mandated his presence to sign over the final liquidation deeds. Richard Sterling was not there. He was currently sitting in a federal holding cell. 2 weeks prior, acting on the immunity deal secured by Eleanor Crawford, Chloe had handed the audio recording over to the FBI. The raid on Horizon Capital's offices had made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Richard had been dragged out in handcuffs, his career obliterated, facing a 20-year sentence for pension fraud. Now, it was just Nathaniel left to watch the final rites of his empire. The judge, a stern woman with no patience for corporate theatrics, banged her gavel. We will now open the bidding for the primary asset block of Sentinel Tech, which includes all server hardware, physical real estate leases, and the residual unbreached client contracts, the judge announced. Do we have an opening bid? A tall, impeccably dressed Swiss lawyer, my representative, hired through Dieter's firm, stood up in the front row. Your Honor, on behalf of Ethelgard Holdings, based in Luxembourg, we offer a preemptive bid of $12 million for the entire block. A murmur went through the courtroom. $12 million was an insult. It was pennies on the dollar, but without the Apex IP, the hardware was useless to anyone else. No other tech firm wanted to buy servers that were legally locked out of their own operating systems. The judge looked around the room. Any competing bids? Silence. Going once. Going twice. Sold to Ethelgard Holdings. I smiled, taking a sip of my espresso. I had just bought my own company back for a fraction of its value, entirely free of Nathaniel's debt, Richard's interference, and the board's incompetence. As the gavel fell, sealing the sale, my Swiss lawyer approached the bench to submit the final registration documents. Your Honor, the lawyer said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone. For the public record, as required by the Chapter 11 disclosure rules, I must file the Executive Registry of Ethelgard Holdings, the new parent company of these assets. Proceed, the judge said, shuffling her papers. The sole managing director and primary shareholder of Ethelgard Holdings is Miss Caroline Hayes, formerly known as Caroline Miller. The courtroom went dead silent. On my monitor, I watched Nathaniel's head snap up. His eyes widened in absolute horrifying realization. He stared at the Swiss lawyer, then looked around the courtroom as if expecting me to materialize from the shadows. He finally understood the full scope of what had happened. I hadn't just taken his company. I had waited for him to drown in his own debt, let the federal courts wipe the slate clean, and then I bought the cleansed empire back out from under him, using the very money I had legally protected from his grasp. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the linoleum floor. "No!" he shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "That's her! She planned this! She stole it from me!" The judge slammed her gavel down furiously. "Mr. Miller, sit down and be quiet, or I will hold you in contempt of court." "You don't understand," Nathaniel sobbed, tears finally streaming down his face as two bailiffs approached him. "She took everything. She's the one who destroyed it all." "Mr. Miller, you signed the corporate restructuring agreements that relinquished your claim to her intellectual property. You bankrupted this company through your own gross negligence and subsequent fraudulent activities," the judge fired back, her voice dripping with disdain. "Miss Hayes is a legally recognized, independent corporate entity who just saved this court weeks of liquidation proceedings. Bailiffs, remove him from my courtroom." I watched as the man who had promised to love and protect me, the man who had tried to discard me over an $80 stake, was physically dragged out of the courtroom by his arms, weeping uncontrollably. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind him, cutting off his pathetic cries. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I reached out and pressed the button to end the video feed. The screen went black, leaving only my reflection in the glass. I didn't look like a victim. I didn't look like a scorned wife. I looked like a CEO. The transition was complete. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The snow had stopped falling over Geneva, and the afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting a brilliant, blinding light over the lake. Ethelgard Holdings would merge the Sentinel hardware with the Apex IP by the end of the week. We would re-sign the government contracts at a premium, offering an upgraded, unbreakable security architecture. Within a year, my net worth would eclipse what Sentinel Tech had ever achieved. Nathaniel would spend the next decade fighting federal charges, destitute and despised. Chloe would wear the stain of a federal informant, blacklisted from the industry. Richard Sterling would rot in a minimum security prison. They had all played their parts perfectly. They had mistaken my quiet brilliance for submission. They had mistaken my loyalty for weakness. Vengeance, I realized as I looked out over my new empire, isn't about screaming matches or dramatic confrontations. It isn't about throwing the first punch. True vengeance is architectural. It is about understanding the structural integrity of your enemy's life, finding the single load-bearing pillar they are too blind to see, and quietly, legally, pulling it out. I didn't destroy Nathaniel Miller's world. I simply handed him the pen and let him sign it all away. In the end, the most dangerous mistake a man can make is assuming the quiet woman beside him is merely a passenger in his life. Nathaniel believed his charisma built our empire, completely blind to the fact that my mind was the foundation holding it all together. When he slid those divorce papers across the linen tablecloth on our 10th anniversary, he thought he was executing a flawless checkmate. He didn't realize he was simply signing his own financial death warrant. Today, the ashes of his arrogance are the very soil from which my new legacy grows. I am no longer a shadow, a secret, or a discarded wife. I am the sole architect of Ethelgard Holdings, looking out over the pristine Swiss Alps, answering to absolutely no one. Nathaniel wanted to erase me, to rewrite his future. Instead, he handed me the pen, and I erased him.